Hello and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Bryant and I'll be your host for this webinar. Please make sure your microphones and web cameras are disabled during the presentation to provide for a smooth recording. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments and insights. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is next week on the 28th, Building Your Genealogical Toolkit, and that will be with James Tanner at 5:30 p.m. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we're pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant, who will be giving a presentation on Research Walkthrough Best Practices for Adding a Family from England to Family Tree. After years on the sidelines, Kathryn began doing family history and discovered that she loved it. Her specialty is helping new family historians find success, and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes she's made. Kathryn teaches Sunday classes at the BYU Family History Library. She also presents at Riverton, Utah Saturday seminars and other family history events. Her column on family history ran in the Nauvoo Times for about a year and is still available online. In addition, she is a regular contributor to the Family Search blog. Kathryn works as a technical writer and instructional designer with a focus on usability and process improvement. Besides family history, she loves uplifting music, thought-provoking books, and fall leaves. And if Kathryn is ready, we'll turn the time over to you.
I am ready. Bryant, thank you so much. Let me just get my screen shared here. And you should be looking at the first slide of the presentation, Research Walkthrough. If you're not seeing that, post a note in the chat. We are so happy to welcome you to this webinar today, and I've been super excited about this one. I actually had a feeling that it needed to be done, so here we go. I hope that it is helpful to you. Let's look at what we're going to be covering in the webinar today. First of all, just to get us all on the same page, we're going to talk about the purpose and scope of this webinar because your time is important and I want to be upfront about what we'll be covering so that you can determine whether this will be helpful to you. And then we are actually going to do a research walkthrough with Ann Hollingsworth. So purpose and scope, in other words, the who, why, and what. The intended audience for this webinar is people who love the sleuthing aspect of family history. Also, people who find satisfaction in careful research or who want to. And then those who are interested in learning tips and tricks about English research will also find this webinar helpful. And I did want to comment up front for those of you who may have come to my other classes or been in my other webinars. Most of my webinars tend to be pretty simple and at a pretty basic level for beginners. Many of them are, at least. This one is an exception. It's going to be a bit more on the maybe intermediate side, not super advanced, but it's definitely not real basic. And it's also, I'll warn you up front, it's going to be a little bit on the longer side, just because there's so much information to cover. But again, I just felt like this would be pretty valuable and helpful to people who are trying to kind of ramp up their skills. And so with that being said, why would we even want to do a research walkthrough? One big reason is to see the big picture start to finish in researching a family. Another reason goes back to what I experienced when I first learned to do family history. I remember being a new consultant and having no clue what I was doing. And I was trying to read training materials and talk to people, and people could give me steps, right? Say 1, 2, 3, push this button, or they could even explain to me why to do certain things. But I found that what I needed was the thought process behind what was going on. Like, how did you think through that you should use that record? Or what was your thought processes what was your thought process for taking this approach rather than that approach, or using this strategy? And so what I'm going to illustrate today obviously is just one way of doing things, but I hope to kind of peel back the cover of the thought process so that hopefully that will be helpful to you as you're doing your own research. Another reason, whoa, I don't know what happened to that title. Sorry about that. Sometimes the slide in my authoring program, Google Slides, doesn't look the same as when it's broadcast. But anyway, that title is supposed to be the same thing. Why do a research walkthrough? And another reason is we see a lot of the ideal, right? When people are teaching, you've probably seen cycles like this, the research cycle where you have the different steps that you're supposed to follow. But I don't know if you guys' life is like this, but when I do research, it looks a lot more like this than this. The thing is, real life, as we know, it's messy, right? In real life, the process has twists and turns, but that's not to say that the ideal or the abstract isn't helpful, because it is. So both the ideal principles and real life examples are helpful. And that's what we're going to be doing in this webinar today, is looking at both of those things. As you notice from the title, our location is England. The reason I wanted to reiterate that is that our specifics are going to apply to English research, obviously, but the principles and examples can be applied more broadly. So if you research in other countries, and I suspect that most of us do, even with our interest in England and our ancestors in England, most likely we've got ancestors in other areas as well. So as we go through this webinar, I'd invite you to think how these principles and examples could be applied in other locations. I wanted to comment also on the time scope for this webinar, and in a minute you'll see why I felt that was important. We are going to be focusing on the years when censuses and when civil registration are available in England. So what that means, civil registration started in July 1837 in England. So we will be focusing forward from that point. And then also the first census that shows entire households, the name of every person, is in 1841. So we're going to go 1841 onward. That being said, there will be a couple of people that we'll see who were born before this time, but they all lived during this time. So this is the focus. And you might be saying, well, why would you do that? The main reason is that in England, what I've discovered at least, is that research when civil registration and censuses are available is very different than research before that time. Because before that time, you mostly have to rely on church records and also some wills and things like that. But civil registration and census, these two types of records are really a game changer for family history. Now, of course, church records are also available at this time, so we'll be taking advantage of all these records. But one thing I've said before in classes is just there's easy research, and then there's harder research, and then there's incredibly difficult research. So you can't just say research is always hard. Some of it's easy, some of it's medium, some of it's really hard. For a research walkthrough like this, because it's complicated enough as it is, I wanted to stick with a simpler time period. So that was my rationale for choosing this. And maybe in the future, we'll do a walkthrough where you only have older records before civil registration and census. But for now, this is our scope. We are going to follow the basic research process now that I kind of said that it never works this way, which it does work this way on a very high level, but you're going to notice this is a completely unscripted webinar. In other words, I haven't chosen a textbook example just so everything goes smoothly. And I also didn't censor, as I went through this process myself in preparation for this webinar, I didn't say, oh, well, that didn't work out, so I'm not going to show that. I'm going to show you the stuff that didn't work out because it's all part of the process. But we are going to follow this basic cycle, this research cycle, and I'm not going to mention this again because I'm pretty sure you'll be able to recognize it. You know, review what you know, know, set a goal, decide which records could help, actually search the records and process the results, and then finally update family tree. I said family tree here, but this could apply to your personal tree on like Ancestral Quest or Roots Magic or Ancestry or whatever. It's basically updating whatever records you keep of your family. So that being said, with that as a backdrop, let's start our research walkthrough with Ann Hollingsworth. So throughout the webinar, I'm going to be highlighting some principles and best practices. And one of my very favorites, one that actually changed the way I do family history, is this one that you see on the screen. Use what you know to discover what you don't know. I find that whenever I feel like I'm in a dark tunnel, it's because I've forgotten this principle. So you always want to build from solid ground. In other words, what you've already proven to things that you're trying to prove. And if you can establish that link, your research is going to be so much more enjoyable for one thing, but it's also going to be more accurate. So with that principle in mind, let's take a look at Ann. So this is Ann's person page in Family Tree, and you notice that she is born in 1856 in Evenden, Lincolnshire. Let's look at her family. You notice that she's got parents. She's got a dad, Samuel, and a mom, Elizabeth, and she's got a few siblings, but she has no spouse or kids. So our research goal is going to be to find out whether Ann married and had children. If she did not, this is going to be a very short webinar. Part of looking at what we already know is to review the sources. So this is a screenshot of what was on Ann's source page when I started this project. And you notice that, or this research walkthrough, you notice the first thing there is her civil birth registration. So, and I think I forgot to say this, civil registration is basically the reporting of a birth, marriage, or death to a government authority. So in England, you had to report births, marriages, and deaths from July 1837 onward. There actually, there's penalties for not complying with that law. So that was a strong motivation for people to comply with civil registration. Then we've got 3 versions of the same christening record. This might be familiar to you. My suspicion is that these came from extraction. And if you're not familiar with extraction, it's just the old version of indexing. So volunteers would just write down information from parish registers of the Church of England. They'd write down christenings, marriages, burials, and so forth. And then those were put into Family Tree. Or actually, excuse me, though, well, yeah, a lot of them were put in Family Tree, but also these records were added to Family Search historical records. So the reason there might be 3 is, one of the reasons is in England, you had your original records kept by the curate of the parish, but the law also at a certain point had the I guess the curates or whoever was responsible, maybe some type of scribe, make duplicates of those records called bishop's transcripts. So that accounts at least for some duplication, and there are probably other reasons. But all 3 of these records are for the same christening for Annie. And so for that reason, it was important to attach all of them because they all apply to her. And then finally, we've got an 1861 census. This is the first possible census that Ann can appear in, and she's a 4-year-old. But this is the complete snapshot of this source page, and there are no other censuses currently attached. So we've got a really good picture of Ann as a young child with her birth registration, christening, and the first census, but really nothing beyond that. So I wanted to introduce you here to a research log called the Timeline Grid. This is actually my favorite method of collecting information. And I'm displaying it here not only to help you be a little familiar with it, but also to illustrate what we already know about Annie. So the way the Timeline Grid works is in the first column, we put the names and vital information. Then there's one column per census, and there is one row per person. Now, I haven't put Annie's siblings on here just because there wasn't room, but you can see how this gives us a snapshot of the family. We can follow Samuel through the census, and we see that he was born in Pickworth. He was a general laborer, apparently worked in the farm. Sometimes it just says laborer, sometimes it says ag lab, which means agricultural laborer. We can see Elizabeth both before she got married and when she was married. And then we see that Annie only shows up this one time in the census. By 1871, when I found Samuel, Annie wasn't there anymore. And unfortunately, neither was Elizabeth, but I found her death. So she was deceased by that time. But at this point, we don't know what happened to Annie. And that's what we're going to try to find out today in our research walkthrough. For more information, again, the purpose of this webinar, as you saw from the scope, isn't to go into a lot of detail about these tools. Rather, we're trying to stick with the big picture. So if you would like more information about using the timeline grid, you can go to tinyurl.com/timeline-grid, and you'll see a page that looks like this with links to both templates and more information. And also, you're welcome to email me. I'll be showing my email at the end of the webinar. So we're now that we've established our goal, we are to the step of determining which records would help us meet our goal to find whether Anne married and had children. So there are 4 records at this time that you'll just about always want to search in England. The first one is census records, not too surprising, right? Because that will show you the residents and also the family members. The next record that will be very helpful, especially in our particular task, is marriage records. At this time in England, not only did marriage records give, obviously, the date and place of marriage and the name of the bride and groom, but they also included fathers' names and occupations. So that is a really good, marriages are really good records for trying to link a bride or a groom from their birth family to their married family. Another great source of records, or great source of information, as we've pointed out, are civil birth registrations. Not only do they give solid information about the birth, if you order the certificate, you actually get the birth date, but they give the mother's maiden name. And at this time in England, there's almost no other record that provides that information, just straight up. Sometimes nonconformist christenings will give mother's maiden names. And by nonconformist, I mean churches that were not in line with the state church, which was the Church of England. So at the time that actually, I honestly don't know if the Church of England is still considered the state church. I'd have to look that up. But at the time period we're talking about, the Church of England was the established church, and it was even called the established church. And so people that belonged to other churches were called nonconformists. They didn't conform to the Church of England. What's interesting is they kept their own records, and they often would include the mother's maiden name. But seeing as most people did belong to the Church of England, then civil birth registrations are one of the very best ways to find the mother's maiden name. And then finally, christening records kept by the church. They will, in addition to the christening date, list the father's occupation, list the residence of the family, and then also sometimes they'll even have the exact birth date. The curate or the clergyman might have written the birth date out in the margin of the christening record. They weren't required to, but that's often a nice bonus. So these are the most likely records that will help us get the information that we're looking for today. So it might be that you're either listening today or watching this recording later on and asking, okay, that's really nice that you know that those 4 records are the most common ones to look in, but how did you know that? How did you figure that out? And as I looked back on my past experience as to how I did come to know this, I would say one method was training. So I would attend classes like this. Another was I would ask a lot of questions. I kind of gave up my ego, if you will. Like, I didn't care if I looked stupid. I just would ask the question, because really in the end, there's no such thing as a dumb question. If you ask questions, you're going to find a lot more information than if you don't. And then also the wonderful Family Search Research Wiki. If you've never visited that, I would say just Google Family Search Research Wiki, and it should be like the top result that comes up. The Research Wiki is a collection of information to help researchers, and it has a lot of information on the types of records that are available in certain places at certain times. So if you're wondering what records to use for a certain research problem, the Family Search Research Wiki is a great place to go. And then the last thing, honestly, you guys, is just experience. This has gotten to the point now, I guess I've been doing English research for, I don't know, 15 years or more. And so now looking at these records is second nature, but it wasn't always that way. The reason I want to mention that is if you look at that and go, oh, I'm never going to remember all this, just be assured that as you continue doing your family history and gain experience, it is going to become second nature for you as well. So those are the types of records. How do we find them? The place that I usually go first is person page record hints, and we're going to look at those. Those are basically low-hanging fruit. Then also on the family tree person page, there are other record searching tools that we're going to look at. And then also you can actually go directly to websites like Ancestry.com, FindMyPast.com. Beyond that, of course, there's other places to search that aren't online. There's actually a huge percentage of records that aren't online. But for today's webinar, we are going to be focusing on online records. And so that's why we're not going to go into detail about searching those other records. That's actually a whole different webinar. Okay, so we are back on Ann's person page, and we've highlighted the hinting and research tools over here on the right-hand side of the page. The first thing that I always check, well, I shouldn't say always, but it's a good idea to always check, is to see if Family Search has any record hints. Well, in this case, 0. There aren't any. So the next thing that I'll usually do to find more information about a person is what I like to call a logo search. And that is just to click one of these logos over here under search records. I like to do Ancestry just because for English research, I tend to get the most and the highest quality results with them the most quickly. But I gotta tell you, Find My Past keeps getting better and better. It used to be maybe 7 or 8 years ago when I would try Find My Past, I would almost never find what I was looking for. But over the years, oh my goodness, I got to tell you, they have been adding so many records and they're so helpful for English research. So really my go-to sites when I'm searching this way is I'll first try Ancestry just because, again, I tend to get the best results with them, and they tend to have a lot of related hints when you're searching for people. Find My Past is my second choice, and Family Search Historical Records is my third. But I'll tell you, honestly, I often use all three of them. In fact, it's pretty rare that I don't use all three of them. So for this part of the webinar right now, we're just going to click Ancestry. Oh, and I realized I forgot to mention, in case you've never done a logo search before or used these buttons here, what they do is they grab all the information off the person page for you and stick it in the search form, so you do not need to type it all in. What a time saver, right? And also for accuracy, it's just great. So they couldn't have made it any easier. You click the logo, it runs the search, and here we are in Ancestry. These are the results that came up. Well, I'm looking at the first one, and that's actually not looking like a very good match. I'm a little bit puzzled as to why it even came up, because the year is right, but I don't see any family members mentioned, and the Hollingworth, the parish, is definitely not right. I checked on Google, and it's not within even a few miles as it, or you know what, now that I say that, I'm not sure that I did check on Google on this one, but let's just go by the name here, Hollingworth, Evedon, they're not close together. And also by 1891, if Anne was going to marry by then, she probably would have a different surname. So all that is a way of sharing my thought process. I should have Googled this. If I didn't, then I would recommend Google it and see if it's like 2 miles away from Evedon. Oh, maybe it's worth looking at. If it's 50 miles away from Evedon, not so much, because at that time in England, people didn't move around a lot. There were exceptions, but a lot of them lived, married, and died in the same parish, and their families did for generations. So we're not going to look at this one. The second one is civil registration. This is actually the Ancestry version of the source that we looked at on Anne's source tab in Family Tree. So it's the exact same record, it's just Ancestry's version of it. So we've already looked at this, we know this is right, but what I found in Ancestry is that civil registration does not give very good record hints. And so for that reason, we're not going to look at civil registration in Ancestry. But the third one looks like it's a pretty good match. So we're going to use what we know to discover what we don't know. We're going to open up this census page, and then we're going to do a quick sanity check. So I've got a screenshot from Family Tree over here on the left, and then the correlated information from Ancestry on the right, just so that we can sanity check it and say, does this really line up? The reason this is so important is that in England, as in many, many other countries, names were used over and over again. There were a lot of common names. Girls, that a lot of families cycled through Anne, Sarah, Jane, Mary, Elizabeth, and those names were just used over and over again. So you can't just judge whether people match up based on the name. You have to look at other things. So let's walk through and look at how well this Ancestry record matches our information that we know is correct in Family Tree. So the name looks good, Annie for Anne. That's not unusual to have that for a nickname. The birth year is close enough. As you probably know, in the census, the estimated birth year is based on the age, and it could be a year off or more based on when the birth date fell relative to when the census was taken. But if this was for a 4-year-old, if this was like 5 years off, I'd be really worried. 1 year off, I'm good with that. I wouldn't see that as a problem. And then finally, we notice that the birthplace is exactly the same. We've got Evedon, Lincolnshire in Family Tree and Evedon, Lincolnshire in Ancestry. Let's sanity check the family now. So in Family Tree, we've got Dad Samuel, Mom Elizabeth, and the kids. As we match them up, we see Samuel's over there, and his age computes to be about right. Elizabeth, same thing. It's pretty close to what we would expect it to be. We've got a little bit of a hiccup here with a Caroline Bradley, and this Caroline was actually an illegitimate child of, I hate that term. You know what? I'm not going to say that. She was born, because children aren't illegitimate, and a lot of times the mom wasn't either. You know, she could have been raped or whatever. So we can never judge somebody for having a child out of wedlock. But be that as it may, Caroline was born before Elizabeth's marriage to Samuel. So we would say she was born out of wedlock. That's why her name is Bescaby instead of Hollingsworth. But Bradley, where did that come from? So I looked at the image, and actually the image says Bescaby. It doesn't say Bradley, but I can't fault the indexer because number one, Bescaby is very unusual, and number two, that poor name gets slaughtered all over the place. I could share with you probably 30 different misspellings that I found over the years. So this really is Caroline. It's our gal. There's no discrepancy there, and the age matches up. And then we've got Anne, and we've got Eliza. So taking these few minutes, do you see how fast that was? That took us, what, maybe 3 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes max to double check this. But it provides such a safeguard against making mistakes, because probably the biggest mistake that I see in Family Tree is people assuming that two people are the same because they have the same name when they really aren't, or assuming that a record is about somebody because the names match, but they don't look at the other information to see that, oh, this is a totally different Samuel Hollingsworth or Elizabeth Bescaby or whatever. The thing with Family Tree is once you start doing bad merges or attach bad sources, they attract additional bad merges and bad sources. So it's worth it to be careful. So now that we're very confident that this 1861 census is for our Annie, let's take a look at these suggested records. So when you look at the suggested records for Ancestry, there's a couple of caveats that I wanted to make. You remember before we looked at the record hints in Family Tree on the person page, which essentially is the same thing. Basically, the system is searching for records that are probably about this person. So in Family Tree, what you'll find, or at least this has been my experience with English records, is that you will get fewer records, but they will be more likely to be a good match, up to about 95% in my experience. On the other hand, in Ancestry, you'll get more records. I mean, look at all the records here when we had no records in Family Search, in Family Tree. But these records are less likely to all be correct. In other words, the accuracy percentage drops a little bit. So I would say in my experience, about 80% of these hints are really about this person over here. So is one right and one wrong? Absolutely not. They're just different approaches and they both have pros and cons. So Family Search will give you fewer record hints, but more likely to be correct, around 95%. Ancestry will give you more, but the overall accuracy rate drops a little bit to 80. It's still awfully good. And a lot of the times these hints, obviously 80% is that they're going to be for the person that you're looking at. So what do you notice about these record hints? As you look at this, do you see anything that might give us a hint about whether Annie married and who she married? If you said, yes, I see some hints for an Ann Russell, that's what I noticed as well. So right now we've got a theory at least that Anne may have married a Mr. Russell. So with that as a hint, let's move forward in this research walkthrough to prove or disprove that theory. And we're going to do that using census, marriage, and birth records. So our next step here, what I would normally do in a situation like this is look at the first census that is after the 1861. So I don't see, well, and where she's married, sorry. So there is an 1871 census, and actually, sorry, I was thinking back to the timeline grid where I had not found her as a single woman in the 1871. This would be worth checking into. But for right now, since we're trying to prove whether she married a Mr. Russell, then let's look at the 1881 census because that's the closest one that shows her with a married name. So here is the screenshot from the 1881 census. This handwriting is a little bit difficult to read, so we've got a transcription down here. Notice that they were enumerated in Revesby, Lincolnshire, and Mary Boyington is listed as the head of household with a William S. Russell as her nephew. And then everybody else is listed in relationship to the head of household. So we don't have all these people's relationship to Russell, but we can kind of deduce it, right, from the ages and the genders of the people. So as we look at this, we notice a couple of interesting things. One is that Anne's age and birthplace match what we already know about her. So that's actually encouraging. This is pointing towards the fact that she may very well have married this Mr. Russell. Another real interesting thing here is that we find somebody with the surname of Hollingsworth, or Hollingworth actually. And I don't think I mentioned this before, we're not going to get hung up on whether there's an S or not, because back at this time in England and in many other nations, people just didn't care about spelling. And actually, a lot of people couldn't read and write. And so just whoever was writing the information wrote it down as best they could. So we'll find Hollingworth, Hollingsworth, sometimes one L, sometimes two, but the differences don't mean that they're different people. They're just different spellings of the same person. So this may be a clue. The fact is that you may have noticed that in this census, Alice and Elizabeth are really young. And sorry, this is blocking the ages, but as I recall, Alice was, I think, 2, and Elizabeth was maybe a few months. So there's actually quite a gap between Alice, the first child of the marriage, and this Fred Hollingworth, who was probably born before the marriage. And so the fact that he's a Hollingworth indicates that he's probably the out-of-wedlock son of Anne, and we can look to prove that later on. But it is encouraging that she's got a son with the name of Hollingworth. And then finally, probably the most important thing that we notice from the 1881 census is that now we have a full name, an age, and a birthplace for Anne's possible husband. So the next step that I would want to take here is to check out this marriage registration. Again, I'm letting Ancestry do the heavy lifting here. I'm taking advantage of these hints that Ancestry has already found for me. So I'm going to click on this possible marriage registration, and we see a few things of interest. First of all, the spouse's name matches because we had a William S. Russell, so William Shepherd Russell, that works. And they are in Horncastle. So Horncastle is the registration district, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail about how registration districts work, but if you're interested in that, there's actually a couple of webinars that are listed on the BYU Family History Library webinar page that talk about the GRO, which is the General Register Office. They're in charge of civil registration. So if you'd like to learn more about how registration districts work, I would suggest looking at those webinars. Or, oh, I just remembered, you could also go to the research wiki and look up English civil registration and get a good explanation of registration districts. But with that background, let me just say that I looked it up and learned that Horncastle is the registration that contains the parish of Revesby, which was where the family was living in the 1881 census. So that's another thing that is lining up. But look at the year. There's no year. So like I said, I didn't whitewash this or try to make it look good when it wasn't. I have to admit, I don't think I've ever seen this before. What are the chances, right? I'm doing a webinar and the civil registration record that I look at has no year. Fortunately, Family Search Historical Records also has civil registration indexes. These are actually indexes to the actual marriage records. You have to pay to get the marriage records, but the indexes are free. So you'll notice that most of the major sites, in fact, all the major sites I'm aware of, have English civil registration indexes. My Heritage has it, Find My Past has it, Family Search Historical Records has it, and obviously here we are in Ancestry and they have it as well. So let's pop over to Family Search Historical Records and see if they index the registration year. And when we get over there, one way we can tell, there's a couple of ways we can make sure that we found the equivalent record in Family Search Historical Records. One is obviously if the names match, also if the registration district matches, but also if the registration quarter matches, so we're in the first quarter of the year, and also if the volume matches. So let's hop over to Family Search Historical Records. I got here by clicking Search and then clicking Records. And I want to narrow it down to just English marriage records. So I'm going to fill out the collection title here. This is kind of a filtering box in the Find a Collection area. This is really small, so let's blow that up. I just started typing England marriage reg, and you notice I didn't even have to type the whole word registration, and the record I wanted came up. Now notice that this doesn't contain the word civil, even though it's commonly called civil registration, but it does contain the word registration, and it does tip us off because 1837 is when civil registration started in England. So I'm going to click this record, and I get taken to a search form that is only going to search civil registration. So this is a good way of focusing your search. And I just fill out all this information here. We've got Ann. If you wonder why I put the asterisk here, it's so that I'd have a better chance of finding it with the S and without the S, because the star can stand for 0 to an infinite number of characters. And then the marriage year, I wanted to comment on that. I know she's married by 81, but in 71, according to the record hint, she was still using her maiden name. So for that reason, I'm pretty confident that she probably got married in this 10-year span. And then I put in the spouse's name. Well, when I search, look who comes up right at the top, and they have a year, 1879, which fits within our expected range. Let's open up this record and just kind of sanity check it. Okay, the registration district is correct. The registration quarter matches what we saw in Ancestry, and the volume matches what we saw in Ancestry. So we're now comfortable that, this is our marriage registration and that the year is 1879. So now we move on to our next principle or best practice, and that is don't assume. Instead, find evidence. So can we be confident with what we have that this marriage really is for our Anne? I don't think so, not quite yet. And this is why. Let's walk through the thought process of this. So the marriage is a really good match for the family in 1871. The registration district matches the parish, the names match. So I'm pretty sure that that marriage registration is for this family. But we have not yet found proof that Anne, the daughter of Samuel, is also Anne, the wife of William Shepherd. Those hints provide the ancestry hints point that direction, but like I said, I've seen ancestry hints that weren't correct because they're system generated, so we can't expect them to all be perfect. So I want a little bit more proof. I want a higher level of confidence that Anne, the daughter of Samuel, really is the same person as Anne, the wife of William Shepherd. So what we need is a record that links what we know, that Anne is the daughter of Samuel, to what we believe is probably correct, and that is that Anne is the wife of William Shepherd. So at this time in England, what we really need is a marriage record. And so I looked all over. I looked on Find My Past and Ancestry and every place that I would expect to actually find the marriage record, not just that index that we were looking at, and I couldn't find it. So I ended up ordering the civil registration certificate. And yeah, it cost a little bit, but there are times when it's worth it. I'll level with you. I don't usually buy these certificates unless I can't get the information any other way. But in this case, I figured that it was worth it. So again, handwriting can be a little bit challenging. So let's look at a transcription. We've got a William Shepherd Russell marrying an Ann Hollingsworth on the 16th of March in 1879. They were both single when they married. In other words, no previous marriages. The ages all line up. Look at what we've got here. So we've got Anne's age matching the other records for her, and we've got proof that the woman who married William Shepherd Russell was the daughter of Samuel Hollingsworth, a laborer. And if you remember from the timeline grid, that's exactly what we saw for Samuel. He was a laborer, and this is his name. So now we haven't found any contradictory evidence, but we have found a ton of confirming evidence. So I feel really, really comfortable that our Anne, the daughter of Samuel, is the same person who married William. And that opens up our research walkthrough. This was like a little narrow place that we had to pass through before we could kind of run with our research. It reminds me of kind of opening the floodgate. So let's go back to that 1861 census and look at all these hints we've got. We've got not only that 1881 census that we've already looked at, but we've got the 91, the 1901, 1911. So at this point, what I do is look at all those records and populate all that information into the timeline grid, because it gives me a complete picture of that family. This is obviously very small, and we're not going to read through this, but I just wanted to give you a visual of what it looks like as I add the information as I find it. But there's one thing I did want to point out that's going to be very important for the rest of our research walkthrough, and that is that in the 1911 census, Anne and William say that they have 12 children, but 9 are living. This is one thing I love about the 1911. It's actually the only English census that gives this information. In the United States, as some of you may be aware, both the 1900 and the 1910, if I recall correctly, give that information, but in England, we've just got this one census. So whenever somebody shows up in the census, that's definitely, in the 1911, definitely worth paying attention to. So let's go to the the next principle and best practice, and that is be sure that you account for all the children, because who wants to be left out, right? Don't we all long to be included? And I'm sure it's the same way for these families. We want them to be complete. We want to be sure that we're not missing anybody. So here, because the whole timeline grid would not fit on a slide, here's a summary of the information about the children that I found in the census. And I numbered them to make it easy for us to keep track of whether we found all the children, and they're listed in birth order. So we've got Fred, and then we've got Alice and Elizabeth. You remember seeing them in the 1881. And then there's the rest of the children, but we stop at 10. Now, we're missing probably 2 children and possibly 3. Why do I say we might be missing 3 children? Because the instructions given on the 1911 census were that the family was supposed to list the children born to the current marriage. Sometimes people did that, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they included children from other marriages or other relationships. I honestly don't think that Fred is the son of William Shepherd Russell, because look how far ahead he was born of the marriage. Usually if a woman got pregnant before marriage, she would tell the guy if she wanted, well, I don't want to speculate too much, but what I've seen in my family is that when a woman got pregnant before marriage, she might try to get the guy to marry her. And if he was really the father of the child, they'd get married pretty soon. So if William was the father of Fred, I would have expected them to get married around 1874 or 1875 instead of 1879. I would not expect them to have a child out of wedlock and wait 5 years to then get married. Not impossible, but I just think it's pretty unlikely. So the reason I'm saying that is I really don't think Fred is the child of this couple. So if he's not, and if they completed the census correctly according to instructions, Anne and William had 12 kids, and then Fred would be a 13th. But at this point, we just don't know, because I've seen 1911 censuses where I've been able to prove that the family included children not of the current marriage. So we've got some more research to do. So the next place that I wanted to touch on that is incredibly valuable in English research is to do, or the next process is to do a systematic GRO search for missing children. What's the GRO? Stands for General Register Office, and they're the government entity tasked with civil registration. Here's the URL right here. The reason I included the URL is because if you Google GRO, you're going to get some links that take you to the right site, but don't make it easy to get to the search page that we want to use. So I know this is long, but I would recommend going straight to this search form instead of trying to navigate there. It's just kind of a pain. So when you go to this URL up here, this is what you're going to get, a search form that looks something like this. Search forms are pretty straightforward, right? We use them all the time. But doing a systematic search is a little bit tricky because of the way the GRO search engine or search form works. So let's walk through it. You're going to choose birth because that's what we're looking for. That's pretty straightforward. Then you want to start with the marriage year or up to a year or two after, and it'll be clear why in just a minute. You've got this plus or minus drop down over here. The farthest you can go is 2 years plus or minus. You can't make it any greater than that. So you're limited to searching a 5-year span at a time. So that's one reason I chose 1880 instead of 1879. Because I'm going to need to repeat this search over and over in 5-year increments. And it's just easier to go 1880, 1885, 1890, 1895, rather than doing on an odd number and then going, okay, 79, 1, 2, 3, okay, that'd be 84. Now I want to go to 89. Do you see what I'm saying? It just, I don't know, for me at least, it's easier on round numbers and fives. So, and the setting it to 1880 with 2 years plus or minus is going to cover 1879, the year of their marriage. Just to clarify this, the reason plus or minus 2 does a 5-year span, you might think it'd do a 4-year span, but the reason it's 5 is that it does 2 years before 1880, so it does 78 and 79, and then 2 years after 1880, which is 81 and 82. So it basically goes from 78 to 82. And you just have to search the 5-year span. I wish there was a way to include more years, but it is what it is. So the next thing that we do is enter only the surname, because if we're looking for missing children, obviously we don't know their first name, so we do not want to complete that. Then the other restriction on this search is that you do have to specify the sex of the child. So you cannot search for females and males at the same time. You have to choose one or the other. So essentially what you've got to do is run this 5-year span search on 1880 for the females, then rerun it with males, then move to 1885, run it for males and females, then go to 1890, run it for males and females. Do you get the process there, the system or the pattern? So that's how you do this systematic search. And then we're going to put in the birth registration district here because we know all the kids from the census, we know they were all born in Revesby, so we would expect our missing kids to be born there as well, and that will help narrow down the search results to put the district of birth. And then finally we click search. And this is what we came up with. So you notice the kids in red are 2 new children that we found by doing that systematic GRO search. Caroline here was born in September quarter, or rather registered. So she was born later in the year. The 1891 census was taken earlier in the year, and apparently she missed it. Her mom was probably pregnant with her at the time the census was taken, but she wasn't born yet. So she wasn't recorded in the census, and then probably she died before the next census because we never see her in the census, but that will have to be proven. Then we have an unnamed son, and that just always makes my heart have a little pang, because when a child was not named, it was usually because they expected the child to die very soon, or the child had already died by the time the registration was done. So we don't even have a birthplace for this unnamed son because he never appears in a census, but because all the other kids were born in Revesby, it's a safe bet that he was too. Oh, and I just noticed I didn't put Frank's birthplace, but he was also born in Revesby. So all the kids were born in Revesby. So we have just found 2 additional kids that were missing before, but we're still not sure if we're missing that 13th kid. So what we want to do next, another place that we can try to verify this, is christening records. So as you recall, Anne had 3 extracted christening records. That says to us that Family Search, or whatever the entity was at the time, probably we could just safely say the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was doing extraction in England at this time and place. There's a really good chance that Annie's kids got extracted as well, and that they have christening records in the system. So let's look in Family Search historical records and see if we can find any. So how to search for christenings for all of a couple's children. This is kind of a neat trick. Very similar, actually, to what we just did in the GRO. Excuse me, I'm going to take a little drink of water here. Yeah, when you talk for a while, your voice kind of gets scratchy sometimes. So this is a really cool trick in historical records. Again, I got here by clicking search and clicking records, and we've got this search form. So once again, I'm not going to put in first names because I want all the children of this couple, whatsoever first name they may have. I am going to put in the last name. We've got the parish of the kids, the birth parish, so I put that in. This search form does allow a range, so that makes it a lot easier. You can just search for all the kids at once. So my beginning year is the marriage year. My ending year is the 1911 census, when they told us they have 12 kids with 3 deceased. And then I just fill out the parents. I tell Family Search that I only want birth and death records. I'm kind of hoping that I'll get some death records for those kids that died. And then I click search. And look what we got. We actually got a boatload of results. So we've got kids here that we recognize from the census and from civil birth registrations. I'm not going to walk us through all these because it turned out there were about 50 of them, and they were all for this family. There were just a lot of duplicates, just like there were for Annie. So I'm just going to show the summary of what I discovered here. Oh, I forgot. One very interesting thing that showed up in these search results is that some of these christening records are already attached to people in family tree. So that means some of these kids are already there. They just weren't connected to Annie, to our Annie, the record we were looking at, as her children. So she's out there separate, but her kids are out here floating around unattached from extracted christening records. One thing we want to point out about christening records is that when these records were extracted, the extractors, or what we would call indexers today, they were instructed to take the names of the parents out as well. So every one of these extracted christening records, so for Annie, for Caroline, for Mary, and for Elsie, not only is there going to be a record for Elsie it's attached to it, but Elsie is also going to have a dad attached and a mom attached. So we're talking about a whole bunch of duplicates based on these records that we're looking at. So let's look at the summary of the christening information. I never was able to find an extracted christening for Fred. It's possible that Anne did not have him christened. I don't know. I'd have to do a little bit more searching on that. But in Family Search historical records, I did not find a christening. But all the other kids I did, and I put the dates here up to Samuel. For some reason, couldn't find him. I also didn't find the unnamed son. And I also didn't find any evidence of another child. All the christening records were for children we already knew about. So based on the fact that civil registration did not have a 13th child, and that christenings did also not have a 13th child, I'm leaning towards believing that when William and Anne gave their count of children in the census, they included Fred as one of those children and were not actually looking for a 13th child. So now we've got some more low-hanging fruit here. Let's attach these children that we found in Family Search historical record, or excuse me, that we found through Family Search historical records. So I'm going to click the pedigree icon. That's going to tell me who the record is attached to. I'm going to copy this PID. Then I'm going to go back to Ann's page, and I'm going to use the PID to add Caroline as Ann's child. We're not going to go into detail about how to do that. Again, that's beyond the scope, the step-by-step of this. It's a pretty common thing that people do, but you would want to repeat that for all the other children that are already in Family Tree. This is an example of the types of duplicates I was talking about. So we're looking at Elizabeth Annette Russell's record. She's got these extracted parents, but we also added her to her mother who was already in Family Tree. So now we want to merge this Ann, and every other child that was already in Family Tree is also going to have these duplicate parents. So we're going to want to merge all of those as well. Again, walking through the merge process is beyond the scope of this webinar. And so if you're interested in that, I would refer you to the webinar listing of the Family History Library and just look for the webinars on duplicates and merging. But guess what I found as I looked at the kids? All of them looked good except Alice. What's wrong with Alice, you guys? Look at this information. Yeah, she's born 2 years after she's christened. And as far as I know, the Church of England did not practice premortal christening. And so this is evidence of a bad merge. When we look at the parents, oh, excuse me, and I forgot to point out, it's also a completely different location. If someone was born in London, England, we would not expect them to go over to the little parish of Revesby for a christening. And look at the other information that indicates a bad merge. We've got a mother with the wrong maiden name, because remember, we did our research and we know her name is Hollingsworth or Hollingworth. The siblings don't match what we know. And then also the mother from the extracted record is still here. So this is the real mother and this is the fake mother as the result of a bad merge. To make a long story short, I dug into this and dug into this and found that the problem was that Alice's father, William Russell, was incorrectly merged with a different William Russell, who was a totally different person. He was the William that married Annie Cope, not the William who married Annie Hollingsworth. So the solution was to restore Alice's real father and disconnect her from the wrong family. So for information, again, the scope of this webinar is not to walk through repairing bad merges, but there's another webinar for that, fixing sticky, tricky problems in Family Tree. So if you're interested in a very detailed examination of how to do this, I would refer you to this webinar. Okay, so next best practice, and we're almost done here, folks, is to beware of the same name trap. Just because two people have the same name does not mean they're the same person. You have to use a lot of other information to confirm whether or not they're truly the same person. What about those 3 deceased children? I went to one of my favorite sites, which is Free Reg. It stands for Free Parish Registers, freereg.org. .uk. This site has transcriptions of parish registers to the tune of 46 million. I have found things on this site I've never found anyplace else. This is a good illustration. When I searched there for burials, I found that our sweet little Caroline, you remember we theorized that she died young because she never showed up in the census. She died at age 1. And then Mary, to my surprise, turned out to be one of the other children that died before 1911. She died in 1900 at age 11. I do believe that the third child is this unnamed child, again, because parents, normally the only time they didn't name a child is if the child was in danger of dying or had already died. But I looked for the death registration and could not find it. So I still don't have proof, but that's something I'm going to have to do after this webinar, is try and find the necessary proof that this child is the one who died. And then we will have accounted for all 3 of the deceased children. So verify that the children lived past date. This is of particular interest to members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because it affects temple ordinances. So if a child lives past date, they need different ordinances than if they don't. So the final steps, now that we've done our due diligence, this is what we're looking at doing. The thing is, we've done the hard part. We've done the thinking. We've done the researching. Now it's basically just dotting our I's and crossing our T's. I'm just going to list the things that we need to do, but we're actually not going to demonstrate those on the screen. We need to add birth information for William from the census because his current record was an extracted parent record with no birth information. We add the rest of the children to family tree. We add the death and burial information for the deceased kids, add the marriage date with the certificate as a source, attach all the record hints. And the more we add this information, the more record hints are going to show up. And then we want to verify that all census records and civil registrations are attached because, again, we know that we should be finding the family in those records. So doing our due diligence means looking for those records and making sure they're attached as sources. And then finally, we want to attach non-family search historical record sources, such as those burials from Free Reg. The end result is that we are confident that the family is complete and well documented. So here's a summary of what we talked about today. Use what you know to discover what you don't know. Don't assume. Instead, look for evidence. Be sure to account for all the children. Beware of the same name trap. Verify that kids lived past date. Attach available sources for the time period from Family Search historical records, and then also attach any non-Family Search historical records as needed. That brings us to the end of our webinar, and I thank you for your patience and your interest. And Bryant, do we have any questions that we need to address?
Yeah, thanks, Kathryn. It looks like we do have a couple questions in the chat box. Terrell asks, why is one child in Beskeby and others in Hollingsworth?
Yes, I remember that slide. That's a great question. It was asking why Caroline was a Beskeby and the rest of the kids were Hollingsworth. And I did some research and found out it was because Caroline was born to her mother out of wedlock. And so when a child was born out of wedlock in England, in other words, the woman was not married at the time to anybody, then the child would take the mother's maiden name. So that's why. And even on future census records and so forth, after the mother married a person, the child's legal name was still the mother's maiden name as a surname. So that's why. Good question.
Awesome. And Ben asks, Shepherd was also spelled as Shepherd. Would you add an asterisk there too?
Oh, that's a good question. If I was searching for that, honestly, this is just based on my experience. I don't have anything to really back this up, but I noticed that the search engine, at least in Family Search, and I think even on Ancestry, yeah, Ancestry I think was actually better at finding these records than Family Search was. It kind of didn't find variations on Hollingsworth. So if I put in Hollingsworth, it found me a bunch of Hollingsworth, but not without the S. Whereas on Ancestry, it found me a mix of both. On the other hand, I noticed with vowels like in Shepherd, both Ancestry and Family Search are really good at realizing that those are just variations. So I don't know what it is about that S in Hollingsworth that made Family Search not find it quite as well. But for the Shepherd, I probably wouldn't use the wild card just because the search engine seems to be finding those variations. Great question. And you know what? I'll say this too. It doesn't hurt to use the wild card. Doesn't hurt to put that asterisk in there.
Awesome. And Annette asks, is there only one registration district for London, or are there multiple districts?
Oh, that is such a good question. To my memory, there are multiples. In fact, with a place the size of London, I would be so surprised if there weren't. Do you know what? I wonder if I can let me get out of here really quick because that is a really good question. I'm going to try and stop. Let me get to a new tab, and I'm going to have to drag this Zoom thing out of the way. I've got a bookmark, and I can throw this in the chat. I am looking for the master registration district list. This is amazing. So let me put this URL in the chat. What this is a super long PDF document, but what you notice is that it lists virtually every parish in England over time since civil registration started, and then it lists the county that it was in, the time period in which it was in that county, and then the civil registration district. If a parish was in more than one county or district over time, it lists that too. So this is kind of the authoritative source of how to find what registration district a parish was in. So that should give you the information that you need. I hope that answers the question. Oh, and Cami brings up a good point. I opened up the chat. That Control F will search the PDF. Yeah. And Kathy made a good point. I'm now seeing in the chat that for a larger time span for civil registration, you can use FreeBMD. The downside of that is that FreeBMD does not give the mother's maiden name until, I want to say 1913. It's around that time. So up to that point, if you want to see the mother's maiden name for civil registration, you do have to use the GRO site. Bryant, any other questions that you noticed before these that I just talked about?
There aren't any other questions that I can see in the chat box.
Okay, cool.
Awesome. Well, if that is all the questions from the audience, then that will be the end of the webinar today. Thanks so much, Kathryn, for presenting.
Oh, you bet. And everybody, thank you. And thanks for people that put comments of appreciation in the chat. I appreciate your appreciation.
And just a reminder about our webinar next week on the 28th at 5:30 p.m. Building your genealogical toolkit with James Tanner. So be sure to join us for that. Thanks for joining us today, and have a great day, everyone.